You know the name Doug Papa?
Yes, I do. God bless Doug Papa, an honest cop.
I was elated, of course, but then as he testified, I was somewhat concerned for him, because I knew that they were probably going to crucify that man.
The top cop who put his badge on the line for justice.
One man who confronted truth and consequences.
Welcome to Truth and Consequences with Doug Papa, episode 50 for Thursday, May 13th, 2021. Longtime Las Vegas pimp Jamal Rashid, also known as Mally Mall, made millions of dollars from his prostitution business and pandered hundreds of women, according to the government's sentencing memorandum filed on May 6, 2021 in United States Court for the District of Nevada. Rashid is scheduled to be sentenced today, Thursday, May 13th, in United States Court for the District of Nevada, Courtroom 7D, at 10 o'clock a.m. This will put to an end Rashid's multiple sentencing date continuances. Rashid pleaded guilty in October 2019 after then United States Attorney for the District of Nevada, Nicholas Trutanich, offered Rashid a pre-indictment plea deal of just one count of use of an interstate facility in aid of unlawful activity, specifically a prostitution business in violation of Nevada law. Rashid was not charged with any human trafficking statutes. Many in Las Vegas were perplexed why the government gave Rashid such a sweetheart deal after Rashid admitted to running a continuing criminal enterprise for 12 years. For years, allegations were that Rashid had several Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department police officers on his payroll who were targeting Rashid's rival pimps. No Las Vegas Metro police officers were ever charged with any crime, even after a 5+ year FBI Las Vegas Division investigation into Rashid's illegal activities and alleged police corruption involving some former and current members of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. In October 2019, the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Nevada released the following statement in lieu of holding a press conference. Quote, "In the course of investigating Mr. Rashid, the U.S. Attorney's Office, in partnership with the FBI, did examine and develop information regarding allegations of related wrongdoing that generally have been the subject of media coverage. Following an extensive inquiry, we concluded that there was not sufficient evidence to support any additional charges relating to Mr. Rashid, his associates, or others, and therefore closed the investigation." The following are excerpts from the government's sentencing memorandum that details just how extensive Rashid's criminal enterprise was. The entire document is available on the screenshots in this podcast. Introduction. From at least 2002 through 2014, defendant Jamal Rashid openly ran several escort businesses in Las Vegas that were fronts for high-end prostitution agencies. Defendant pandered hundreds of women over those years under two different business models, quote, independent contractors, unquote, who paid the business a portion of what they earned through prostitution, and, quote, priority girls, unquote, who essentially worked exclusively for defendant and turned over nearly all of the proceeds from prostitution to defendant. Defendant persuaded, induced, enticed, and caused numerous victims to engage in prostitution, including approximately 35 priority girls. Defendant's criminal enterprise earned him millions of dollars. The only way to provide meaningful deterrence and commensurate punishment for defendant's actions is through a significant prison sentence. Accordingly, the United States requests a sentence of 33 months imprisonment consistent with the sentencing guidelines. Procedural background. The FBI began investigating defendant in 2014. In September 2014, the FBI executed federal search warrants at the defendant's businesses and home. On October 29, 2019, the defendant waived indictment and pleaded guilty to one-count information charging 18 U.S.C. 1952 A3, use of an interstate facility in aid of unlawful activity, specifically a prostitution business in violation of Nevada law. Defendant and the government entered into a binding plea agreement. Under the terms of the plea agreement, the parties are permitted to argue for a prison sentence between 1 month and 33 months. In addition, if the court sentences defendant to less than 12 months imprisonment, the defendant will agree to period of home confinement as a special term of supervised release that combined with the term of imprisonment will total 1 year. Factual background. Defendant began his prostitution enterprise in about 2002, and it became an extensive nationwide business in the mid-2000s. The enterprise's profitability and scope peaked in 2014, after which the businesses were shut down because of the initiation of the FBI's criminal investigation. The FBI interviewed approximately 40 women who worked for defendant's business from 2000 to 2014, and approximately 55 other witnesses who had knowledge of the enterprise. In addition, the FBI seized approximately 50,000 pages of documents and numerous digital devices from defendant's house and businesses. In addition, defendant's financial records, including banking and credit card statements, show that defendant ran a high-end prostitution business that transported women across the United States and utilized the internet to post advertisements. Defendant employed hundreds of women as escorts. These escorts were hired as independent contractors. In most instances, a woman would sign a model release form related to their pictures used in defendant's advertising and would sign a 2-page independent contractor agreement. The agreement called for the independent contractor to pay the business 50% of their fee for each escort call. The agreement also falsely stated that, quote, the company does not participate in or benefit from any illegal sex-for-hire practices and will not solicit, schedule, or otherwise arrange appointments for the contractor in which payment has been offered in exchange for sexual favors, unquote. Defendant's business model used what he called priority girls. Defendant personally persuaded, induced, enticed, and caused priority girls to engage in prostitution. Unlike the other women, priority girls were required to give most of what they earned to defendant. In exchange, defendant provided housing in one of several of his properties and the use of high-end vehicle. Priority girls were given the best clients, and it was common for them to earn $1,000 to $10,000 per date. After a woman became a priority girl, she quickly learned that defendant expected her to follow many rules. Most importantly, they only were usually allowed to keep $100 from each call, with the rest going to defendant. But there were other rules. For example, the defendant required priority girls to text him when they went anywhere. They were not allowed to date anyone, and defendant encouraged them to get Rashid-related tattoos to demonstrate their loyalty to him. In addition, defendant would romance many of the priority girls, leading them to believe they were the one who defendant would marry or advance their career in show business. But at the end of the day, defendant's promises were unfulfilled, and the victims realized defendant only cared about the money they earned for him from prostituting themselves. The pre-sentence report details the statements of the 7 victims who were part of the factual basis of the plea agreement. These victims also discussed defendant's threats of surveillance and violence, verbal abuse, and actual violence. The other approximately 28 other victims, who were priority girls, all corroborate the defendant's rules and threats, and some recount violence. Many of the victims stated that the defendant assigned them a code, designated by an amount of cents that they were to use when they made their money deposits or drops for him. The women say defendant used these codes to determine who was making the most money for him, and also as a way to pit the girls against each other in a competition to see who could be the most competitive and please him the most. One recurring theme was that the victims knew that if they stopped being a priority girl and stopped working for defendant, they would immediately have nowhere to live and little to no savings. In 2010, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department executed search warrants at defendant's business, residence, and some of his apartments where priority girls lived. Defendant was not deterred and continued his illegal business. No charges were ever brought. It was not until 2014, after the FBI executed search warrants and began to interview victims, that defendant's business was halted. Section 4, Sentencing Argument. The government recommends a 33-month sentence in accordance with the plea agreement. There is also within the advisory guideline range as determined by the pre-sentence report and the government. The nature and circumstances of this offense reflect the defendant's concerted effort over at least a 12-year period to operate an illegal prostitution business. Defendant's criminal conduct could hardly have been more pervasive and systematic. Defendant's conduct was not the result of a single poor decision or regrettable judgment. Rather, his entire livelihood for more than a decade depended on pandering women every day. Defendant's illegal enterprise was enormous and far-reaching. Defendant spent millions of dollars on online advertising to generate business. The brazen nature of the defendant's criminal conduct is highlighted by the fact that he continued to operate his prostitution business after the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department executed search warrants on his business and residences. Defendant obviously believed he was above the law and continued to operate and grow his illegal enterprise. Any sentence below the low end of the sentencing guidelines calculation would not reflect just punishment or necessary deterrence for a defendant who engaged in an extensive criminal scheme to enrich himself. More importantly, once the court factors in the harm defendant caused his victims, a 33-month sentence becomes more than reasonable. As defendant admitted in his plea agreement, he persuaded, induced, enticed, and caused numerous victims to engage in prostitution. Defendant manipulated his victims into becoming a priority girl and then imposed rules, threats, and violence, all while taking most of the prostitution earnings for himself. The court should consider the large number of women that defendant victimized when fashioning an appropriate sentence. The investigation into defendant's illegal conduct was thorough, but took significant time. In addition, because of COVID, the sentencing has been continued a significant time. Thus, many of the victims do not feel they have closure on this matter. The government believes the binding plea is a proper resolution of the case, and the parties work diligently in reaching the proposed resolution. Section 5, Conclusion. Based on the above, this court should sentence defendant to 33 months in prison and end 3 years supervised release. And now my closing comments. I will have an update in the comments section of this video when and or if Jamal Rashid is indeed sentenced later today. After listening to what I just read, I have to ask what the hell happened in this case. An extensive criminal enterprise for 12 years, pandering hundreds of women all across the country, and making millions of dollars, and the government gave Rashid a plea deal of 1 count. All the women Rashid victimized for years and made himself rich over, and the United States government does not even charge him with human trafficking. Rashid will not even be a convicted sex trafficker. I have read nothing in any document since Rashid took the plea deal in 2019 that the government is going after his assets. Why? Who were the high-end clients all over the country that were paying up to $10,000 per date for one of Rashid's prostitutes? Were they celebrities, politicians, and or other government officials? Is that why Rashid got the plea deal that he did? Does anybody besides myself find it just a little troubling that after the Las Vegas Metro Police raided Rashid's home and business in 2010, that no charges were filed against him by the Las Vegas Metro Police or the Clark County District Attorney's Office? And Rashid continued operating as though he was above the law, to use the government's own words. Was Jamal Rashid above the law because he was paying off Las Vegas Metro Police officers, as has been alleged over the years? And if so, why hasn't any Las Vegas Metro Police officer been indicted for corruption? This stinks. Something is not right here. Thanks for listening.